I trained them for a year and lost them in just one day. The Battle of Midway, 1942. The great carrier battle that turned the Pacific. It was also where the Douglas SBD Dauntless was considered the most successful dive bomber of the U.S. Navy in World War II. One of the most important aircraft to cut off the tentacles of the giant octopus that was spreading across the Asia-Pacific. On the morning of May 8, 1942, the tropical air over the Coral Sea was thick with humidity and the promise of violence. A section of SBD-3s from the carrier USS Yorktown was flying a tense anti-torpedo plane patrol, their pilots' eyes scanning the vast blue expanse for the glint of enemy steel. They were the shield of the airborne guardians tasked with protecting their floating home from the deadly long-lance torpedoes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vejtasa, one of the pilots on that patrol, was already a hero. Just the day before, he had coolly nosed his dive bomber over, plunging through a storm of anti-aircraft fire to put a 1,000-pound bomb squarely through the flight deck of the Japanese light carrier Shoho, sending it to the bottom. He was minutes away from still more excitement. Shortly after 11 a.m., the sky erupted. A swarm of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the apex predators of the Pacific skies, materialized as if from nowhere. Launched from the formidable fleet carrier Zuikaku, they were everything the American dive bombers were not: fast, agile, and built for the deadly ballet of aerial combat. With superior speed and breathtaking agility, the nimble Japanese fighters descended upon the American formation like wolves on a flock of sheep. The SBDs, burdened by their bomber design, were outclassed in every performance metric. But then they came up against Swede Vejtasa. As the first wave of Zeros screamed past tracers stitching the air around his cockpit, Vejtasa's training and sheer grit took over. He keyed his radio, his voice a beacon of calm in the chaos. "Son," he yelled to his radio operator and gunner, "we're in for a scrap. Keep your head and conserve your ammunition. I'll take care of the rest." It was a promise he intended to keep. With guns blazing, the Zeros made pass after pass at Vejtasa's lone SBD. They came from above, from the sides, from the vulnerable 6 o'clock position. It should have been a slaughter. But each time one of the enemy fighters committed to an attack run, Swede would wrench his heavy bomber around, yanking the stick hard to turn into the threat. It was a counterintuitive high-G maneuver that spoiled the Japanese pilot's carefully lined-up shot, forcing an overshoot. Then, in the fleeting seconds of opportunity, Vejtasa would fire back his twin 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the engine, cowling, chattering defiance. Behind him, twin 30-caliber guns hosing down any Zero that lingered too long, his tracers a desperate warning to keep back. During 25 breathless minutes, the deadly dance continued. 3 Zeros relentlessly harassed the single American plane, their pilots incredulous that this lumbering bomber refused to die. Despite the overwhelming odds, Vejtasa's SBD survived. And in a feat that bordered on the unbelievable, the dive bomber pilot fought back against the dedicated fighters and did the impossible. During one of the chaotic turns, Vejtasa managed to get a Zero in his sights. A sustained burst from the powerful 50 cals found its mark. The nimble fighter shuddered, its engine coughed black smoke, and it tumbled from the fight. Another victim of an aircraft it was designed to hunt. Vejtasa had miraculously shot down a Zero. SBDs fought harrowing air-to-air engagements with the Japanese time and time again during World War II, and were officially credited with 138 aerial victories. Clearly, the Douglas SBD Dauntless was no ordinary dive bomber. And while it proved its mettle during the early hit-and-run raids on Japanese-held islands and in history's first carrier-versus-carrier battle in the Coral Sea, the SBD's finest hour, the moment it would forever etch its name into the annals of naval warfare, came during the pivotal Battle of Midway in June 1942. The situation in early June 1942 was dire. 6 months after the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan was ascendant across the Pacific. The Allies were on the defensive everywhere. Now Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had devised a master plan to finish the job. A massive Japanese fleet, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, was steaming towards the tiny American outpost at Midway Atoll. The Japanese descended on the battle area with overwhelming naval might, divided into a transport force to take the island, a main body built around the super battleship Yamato. In the heart of the operation, the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force. This was the same elite force that had struck Hawaii, composed of 4 of the Imperial Navy's finest fleet carriers, Kaga Akagi Soryu and Hiryu. They were veteran ships, crewed by the best trained in the world. Their objective was twofold: capture Midway Island, extending Japan's defensive perimeter, and more importantly, lure the battered U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet into a final decisive battle that would destroy it. Yamamoto was confident of victory. What he didn't know was that his trap was about to be sprung on himself. American naval intelligence, through the brilliant work of Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HIPO, had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew Yamamoto's plan, his targets, and his timeline. He was gambling everything on this intelligence. The U.S. Navy, outnumbered and outgunned, sent its 3 available fleet carriers into the battle area to spring the ambush. There were the USS Enterprise CV-6 and USS Hornet CV-8, sailing under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance. And there was the USS Yorktown CV-5, a battered and bruised veteran of the Coral Sea. Put into dry dock at Pearl Harbor with damage that engineers estimated would take 3 months to repair, she was patched up and sent back to sea in just 72 hours by an army of tireless shipyard workers. She was a ghost ship, a carrier the Japanese believed they had already sunk. Each of these 3 carriers brought 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntlesses to meet the enemy. They were America's primary hope. Before the Navy's SBDs would have their chance, another group of dauntless pilots would be hurled into the fray. The U.S. Marine Corps also contributed VMSB-241, a scouting bombing squadron that included 19 SBD-2s, an older model with less armor and self-sealing fuel tanks than its Navy counterparts. The Marine aviators who fought in the battle were a mix of veterans and fresh-faced youngsters, all flying from the hot, sandy Naval Air Station on Eastern Island Midway. They were led into combat by a determined 39-year-old major named Lofton Henderson. A 1926 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Henderson was a stern-by-the-book officer who knew his men were about to face impossible odds. Their SBDs were not as capable as the Navy's, and his pilots lacked the extensive training in the steep 70-degree dive-bombing attacks that made the Dauntless so lethal. They would have to rely on a shallower, less accurate glide-bombing approach. At 6:10 a.m. on June 4th, as the first wave of Japanese bombers was savaging Midway's facilities, Henderson led his squadron into the air. They took off from Midway and flew to the northwest, a lonely formation heading directly towards the most powerful carrier fleet on the planet. By 7:55 a.m., they found them. 4 Japanese carriers were laid out below a breathtaking sight of naval power. But with that sight came death. The Japanese fleet's combat air patrol, a hornet's nest of agile Zeros, immediately swarmed the approaching Americans. Major Henderson, leading from the front, began VMSB-241's attack. He pushed his SBD into a gently sloping glide-bombing attack on the aircraft carrier Hiryu from an altitude of just 4,000 feet. The air instantly filled with a blizzard of anti-aircraft fire from the ships below and the cannon fire of the Zeros above. His SBD was among the first shot down its port wing, shredded by enemy fire, sending him and his gunner into the sea. There was no fanfare, just a brief trail of smoke, and then nothing. A farewell. The main American airfield at Guadalcanal would later be named Henderson Field in his honor. Today it is known as Honiara International Airport. Although their commander was lost early, on the men of VMSB-241, driven by raw courage, drove home the attack on the Hiryu, Japan's last aircraft carrier, at the Battle of Midway. and won despite the complete sinking of the USS Yorktown. The defeat at Midway is considered one of the most colossal failures in the history of the Japanese Empire. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 248 aircraft, and 3 057 soldiers were lost forever to the depths of the Pacific. When asked about the loss of his Japanese squadrons, Admiral Yamamoto himself once lamented, "I trained them for a year and lost them in just one day." With the crucial victory at Midway, the U.S. military successfully turned the tide in the Asia-Pacific theater. This paved the way for the devastating bombing campaign over Japan, successfully establishing American influence over the region that serves as a bridge between the world's 2 poles. So why was the Dauntless such a key aircraft for the U.S. Navy in the victory at Midway? Was it simply superior, or was it tactically appropriate? To understand the Dauntless and its improbable triumphs, one must look back at its creation. It was forged in the crucible of naval aviation theory of the 1930s, an era when the dive bomber was seen as the most precise and devastating anti-ship weapon in any Navy's arsenal. It was the naval equivalent of a sniper's rifle designed to deliver a single killing blow to the heart of an enemy fleet, the aircraft carrier. Its lineage began with a Northrop BT-1, a respectable but flawed design that gave pilots fits with its poor low-speed handling characteristics. Ed Heinemann, a brilliant and notoriously stubborn designer at Douglas Aircraft Company, took the BT-1's basic airframe and systematically engineered its weaknesses out of existence. The result, initially designated the XBT-2, would evolve into the SBD, an acronym for Scout Bomber Douglas. Pilots, with their penchant for gallows humor, quickly gave it other names. Slow but deadly, and sometimes less affectionately, the Clunk. It was by all accounts an anachronism, even as it rolled off the production line. It was not particularly fast, with its powerful but bulky 200 horsepower Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engine, pulling it through the air at a cruising speed of a mere 150 knots. It was not agile. Its controls were heavy. But what it lacked in grace and speed it made up for in 2 critical areas: ruggedness and stability. The SBD was built like a flying tank. Its semi-monocoque fuselage and sturdy low-wing design could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and still bring its crew home. Pilots frequently returned from missions with massive damage to their aircraft, and SBD staggered back after action in the Coral Sea battle with 214 holes in its airframe. The aircraft also maintained the lowest loss rate of any Navy aircraft during the war. Furthermore, the Dauntless achieved something no other bomber of World War II. It accomplished a positive air-to-air kill ratio, credited with 138 enemy aircraft destroyed versus only 43 losses. But its true genius, the feature that made it the most effective dive bomber of the war, was its iconic perforated or Swiss cheese dive. Sausage dive brakes. These were a pair of hydraulically actuated flaps on the trailing edge of the wings. When a pilot initiated a dive, these brakes would split open with holes in the metal, allowing some airflow to pass through while still creating immense drag. This system was a stroke of engineering brilliance. In a near-vertical 70-degree dive from 15,000 feet, an aircraft would naturally accelerate to terminal velocity, becoming unstable and making accurate bombing nearly impossible. The SBD's dive brakes acted as a governor, limiting the dive speed to a manageable 240 knots. This transformed a terrifying out-of-control plummet into a rock-steady, stable platform for precision bombing. The pilot could make minute adjustments on the way down, keeping the target perfectly centered in his telescopic sight. The aircraft remained controllable, the aim true. It was this stability that allowed pilots like Swede Vejtasa to place a 1,000-pound bomb onto a moving weaving ship from 3 miles up. The cockpit was a Spartan functional space designed for a 2-man team whose synergy was critical to survival. The pilot up front flew the plane, aimed the bombs, and fired the 2 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns. These heavy machine guns were not just for strafing. As Vejtasa proved, they were a potent defensive and even offensive weapon against enemy fighters. In the rear cockpit, facing backward, sat the radio operator gunner. He was the pilot's eyes and ears scanning the vulnerable rear hemisphere for threats. His weapon was a flexible mount, initially a single .30 caliber machine gun, but later upgraded to twin .30s. While not as powerful as the pilot's .50s, these guns were a vital deterrent, forcing enemy fighters to break off their attacks or risk taking hits to their engine or cockpit. The gunner's job was terrifying. He sat exposed, a clear target tracking high-speed fighters while being thrown around the sky by his pilot's violent, evasive maneuvers. The bond between pilot and gunner was one of absolute trust, forged in the terror of combat. Beyond its decisive triumph at Midway, the SBD Dauntless continued to make history throughout the remainder of World War II, operating in both Pacific and Atlantic theaters with remarkable effectiveness. Throughout the grueling Guadalcanal campaign, SBDs operated from both American carriers and Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Dauntless bombers proved especially lethal to Japanese shipping in New Georgia Sound, nicknamed the Slot. These aircraft sank the carrier Ryujo near the Solomon Islands on August 24, 1942, and damaged 3 other Japanese carriers during the 6-month campaign. Moreover, SBDs sank a cruiser and 9 transports during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, thereby cutting off critical Japanese reinforcements. In November 1942, the Dauntless bomber made its Atlantic debut during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. Flying from USS Ranger and 2 escort carriers, these aircraft supported ground operations and attacked naval targets. On November 10th, 9 SBDs from Ranger sank the moored French battleship Jean Bart at Casablanca. Interestingly, this was the second enemy battleship sunk by SBDs within 1 week. SBDs also participated in Operation Leader, attacking Nazi German shipping around Bodo, Norway. The U.S. Army fielded its own version of the Dauntless, known as the A-24 Banshee, which lacked a tailhook and featured a pneumatic tire replacing the solid tailwheel. Notably, the Army's combat experience with the plane was not as successful as the Navy's, primarily due to insufficient training in high-angle dive bombing. From December 1943 until March 1944, an A-24B squadron conducted operations from Makin Island against Japanese-controlled targets in the Marshall Islands. Accordingly, the remaining A-24s were later relegated to training roles or towing targets for aerial gunnery practice. The Navy planned to replace the Dauntless with the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver in 1944. In fact, the Helldiver had advantages, including a more powerful engine, higher maximum speed, and nearly 1,000 pounds more bomb capacity. Nevertheless, once both aircraft operated side by side, the SBD proved superior to its replacement. Many dive bomber pilots preferred the Dauntless for its lighter weight and better low-speed handling characteristics, critical qualities for carrier landings. Hence, the trusted Dauntless bomber remained in service through the end of the war, maintaining the lowest loss rate of any U.S. Navy aircraft in the Pacific theater. Looking back at the entire Asia-Pacific War in World War II, why did Japan lose, despite its initial military successes? Perhaps the final result would have been the U.S. winning, considering the military and economic potential at that time. They were much stronger than Japan. But let's talk about the reasons for Japan's defeat, especially in the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway fundamentally transformed the Pacific War's trajectory. Before this engagement, Japan had dominated naval warfare across the Pacific. Yet within just 5 minutes on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi Kaga and Soryu, setting them ablaze. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. American success at Midway hinged on an ingenious deception to confirm Japanese intentions. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station HIPO in Hawaii, suspected Midway was the target of Japan's next operation, but needed confirmation. In a brilliant tactical move, Rochefort had Midway send an uncoded message stating their water purification system had broken down. Within days, American cryptanalysts intercepted Japanese messages reporting that AF was short of fresh water, confirming that AF in the Japanese naval code indeed referred to Midway. This breakthrough allowed Lieutenant Commander Edwin Thomas Layton, Fleet Intelligence Officer, to provide Admiral Nimitz with precise details about the Japanese plan, The date of attack, June 4th. The approach from the northwest, the order of battle, 4 carriers, 2 battleships, and supporting vessels, and even the timing of airstrikes. Most critically, cryptanalysts determined that the Japanese fleet would be divided into separate task forces, creating opportunities for the smaller American force to engage portions of the enemy fleet separately. The intelligence victory stemmed from 2 primary code-breaking organizations working in concert. Station HIPO in Hawaii, led by Commander Rochefort, specialized in breaking the JN-25 Naval Operational Code. Simultaneously, the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne in Australia complemented these efforts by focusing on diplomatic communications and providing additional perspectives on naval traffic. These intelligence units employed a combination of traffic analysis, studying message patterns, without decrypting content and actual code breaking to piece together Japanese intentions. Rochefort's team worked tirelessly in an underground facility nicknamed the Dungeon, often putting in 12-hour shifts in stifling heat. Their dedication yielded remarkable results by late May 1942. HIPO was reading approximately 85% of all intercepted Japanese naval communications within 24 hours of reception. The cryptanalysts faced immense challenges. The Japanese JN-25 code employed over 45,000 5-digit numbers, each representing a word phrase or complete thought. Additionally, these were further enciphered using an additive table. Nonetheless, through methodical analysis and intuitive leaps, American codebreakers steadily penetrated this system, ultimately providing Admiral Nimitz with the intelligence advantage that led to victory at Midway. A triumph that permanently altered the strategic balance in the Pacific War. Another point that also influenced Japan's outcome was probably the Japanese military doctrine. Many military experts believe that Japan's traditional military thinking proved catastrophically unsuited for modern warfare. As the Pacific conflict stretched beyond the quick victory Japanese planners had envisioned, fundamental flaws in their doctrine became increasingly apparent. For Japanese leaders, surrender was unthinkable. Japan had never been successfully invaded or lost a war in its history. This mindset led to desperate measures as defeat loomed. By 1944, Imperial headquarters grimly concluded, "The only course left is for Japan's 100 million people to sacrifice their lives by charging the enemy." Operation Ketsugo, Japan's last-ditch defense plan for Kyushu, called for 3,000 kamikazes to attack American landing forces, followed by another 3,500 suicide aircraft, plus 5,000 motorboats if needed. Bushido, the samurai warrior code, profoundly shaped Japan's military ethos. Unlike Western traditions emphasizing the sanctity of life, Japanese military culture revered self-sacrifice. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, explained, "It's probably very difficult for you to understand, but to us, it's Bushido." This cultural foundation enabled the kamikaze program, which ultimately sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 more during the Okinawa campaign alone. Technical deficiencies amplified Japan's difficulties. Unlike American vessels, Japanese carriers featured completely enclosed hangar bays without ventilation. Consequently, explosions couldn't vent outward, causing catastrophic damage. Furthermore, Japanese damage control was the responsibility of a small cadre of specially trained engineers, often killed in initial explosions, whereas Americans trained all crewmen in these procedures. Japanese ships also lacked an effective damage control central system, and engineering teams struggled with multi-core electrical cables that were extremely difficult to repair when damaged. Although Japan's naval doctrine emphasized offensive operations, it fatally neglected defensive measures. Ultimately, Japan lost 334 warships and over 300,000 naval personnel, a devastating toll that underscores why Japan lost World War II despite its early successes. Another critical reason for Japan's defeat in the Midway battle was a technological deficiency. Japanese warships were not yet equipped with radar, and thus could not detect American aircraft from a distance. It wasn't until late 1942 that the Shokaku became the first Japanese carrier to be fitted with radar. Radar at the time could detect enemy aircraft from 100 kilometers away, which would have given the fleet a 15-minute window to scramble interceptor fighters. The crew would also have had time to implement damage control measures, such as locking down fuel lines, stowing ammunition, and sealing blast-proof bulkheads. In contrast, Japanese warships relied on visual observation with binoculars, which could only spot enemy aircraft at a range of 10 to 20 kilometers, leaving them with only about 2 minutes to prepare a defense. Consequently, when attacked repeatedly from multiple directions, the Japanese fleet was thrown into a passive position. By the fourth attack wave, Japanese commanders could not scramble fighters in time to intercept the enemy, leaving 3 carriers vulnerable without a protective fighter screen. This 2-minute window also meant the sailors had no time to carry out damage control, resulting in the carriers being struck precisely when their hangars were filled with bombs, ordnance, and fuel. As a result, all 3 carriers were unable to contain the fires and sank. To put this in perspective, the USS Yorktown survived 3 bomb hits because its crew had time to implement damage control measures, whereas Japan's Akagi sank after being struck by just a single bomb. Finally, luck was also a crucial factor. At Midway, a series of random chances helped the Americans achieve victory. The American bomber squadron happened to find the Japanese fleet at the precise moment they were running out of fuel and about to turn back. At the same time, the Japanese fighters were busy dealing with another American squadron. And it was also at the moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. At that time, Japanese aircraft were being refueled and rearmed for a strike set to launch in 15 minutes, so a single bomb hit was enough to trigger a chain reaction that could destroy an entire ship. In those fateful 15 minutes, 3 consecutive strokes of luck fell upon the American squadron. Without this string of fortune, the American pilots would not have been able to hit, or at least not sink, 3 of Japan's large carriers. Another stroke of misfortune for Japan had occurred earlier. A technical malfunction with a scout plane from the cruiser Tone delayed Japan's reconnaissance by 30 minutes. Had it not been for this unlucky event, the Japanese carriers would have been able to launch their strike before the American planes could do anything to them. In war, there is a time for caution and a time for boldness. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway was overly careless, positioning the Japanese forces too far apart to support each other. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo executed it with excessive caution. He violated Yamamoto's plan, which was to reserve half the aircraft to be ready to strike American warships at any moment by ordering torpedoes to be removed and replaced with bombs. Then, upon discovering the American fleet, he decided to wait for the aircraft from the Midway strike to return before launching his attack. If Nagumo had not given the rearming order, or if he had followed Admiral Yamaguchi's recommendation to launch the strike immediately upon receiving the American fleet's position, Japan's force of over 110 aircraft would have inflicted far heavier damage on the American fleet. In fact, those 110 planes were fully capable of destroying all 3 American carriers, along with their escorting cruisers and destroyers, and Japan would have been the victor. Thus, because of one hesitant command from Nagumo, the Japanese forces turned from a winning position to a losing one. Together with El Alamein and Stalingrad, Midway was a turning point in World War II. This battle has become a source of artistic inspiration for many. In 1942, the Battle of Midway was the first film about the conflict directed by the legendary John Ford. He captured vivid, authentic color footage of the real battle. Later in 1976, the film Midway, directed by Jack Smite, depicted the events fairly accurately. Except for a contrived, romantic subplot, the presence of F-4U Corsair fighters, which were not yet operational in the battle, and the promotion of Rochefort to Fleet Intelligence Officer. Most recently, in 2019, Midway, directed by Roland Emmerich, was produced by AGC Studios with a budget of approximately $100 million USD. Its funding came from various sources, including a $60 million USD contribution from CA Media Finance and China's Bona Film Group. The film stars Patrick Wilson, Woody Harrelson, Mandy Moore, Ed Skrein, and Nick Jonas. If you're interested, we highly recommend you seek them out and watch them. Thank you for watching our video. We've talked about the SBD Dauntless, In our next video, we will cover the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber and its own fascinating stories, especially its equally crucial role in helping America achieve victory at Midway. If this sounds interesting to you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll see you in the next video.